Yeah, again, thanks very much for having me over here. It was indeed a long flight, but I've had some time to acclimatize. And we're going to talk about implementing test automation in Agile projects with open source tools. Fairly, long topic. And before I dive into that, and by the way, I totally realize that I'm the guy who's standing between you and your lunch break. That's going to be on in 45 minutes. So I'm going to try and do my best to keep this entertaining and interesting. Test automation, I think it's a hot topic. I mean, we've heard Simon this morning talk about test automation. When you look at the program, it is certainly, there's a red tape through the entire conference that talks about test automation. So very hot topic. And I'm going to tell you a little bit how we did this at eBay. This is not the holy grail. So it's not the Bible. It's just a way we did it after we've hit the wall various times and did it wrong. So we believe that this is now our way of doing it a little bit better than before. So maybe I say some brilliant things, great, take them away with you. Maybe I say some really stupid things, then don't talk about it. So, eBay. Who does not know what eBay does? Good, excellent. That looks a little bit different in Switzerland. So, wonderful. Second question, who does not have an eBay account in this room? Aha, Simon. Come on. Good, I think most people think eBay is the online marketplace where you buy and sell new and old stuff, right? Yes, that's right. That's the place where I work, and that's called eBay Marketplaces. That's the one with this one up here, right? But as you can see, there's also a lot of other companies in the eBay family. And the biggest one being PayPal, obviously, online payment service, but also Gumtree, which I believe is fairly heavily used over here in Australia. Yeah. So as you can see, there's a little bit more to eBay than just that place where you buy new and old stuff. Let's look at a few facts about eBay Marketplaces, the place that I'm speaking for. So eBay was founded in 1995, fairly new company. Based in San Jose in the Silicon Valley, very close actually to Google and all the others. We're about 18,000 employees in total, so including all those other adjacent companies that we also have. Currently about 94 million active users. This is an interesting number. In 2010, we had a transaction volume of about 62 billion US dollars. That's a massive number. If you cut that down into per second, that's $2,000 per second. And I think even that is, the money is just kind of clicking away there. From a testing perspective, that's obviously a very challenging thing because we're kind of in the job to make sure that things work for our customers. And if things don't work, they potentially cost a lot of money. Yeah? So I always find that number quite interesting. Now, for the more tech-oriented guys, 60 million lines of code, depending on who you ask and how you count. So please don't nail me down on this. This is just a rough number. We have about 2 billion page views every day, about 25,000 searches per second, and I'm sure that number is way higher at Google. 25 petabyte of data processed every day in the data warehouse. Who knows how big a petabyte is? 1,000 terabyte, right? 48 billion SQL executions, 2 terabyte of app log files, and about 14 gig peak network utilization. These are numbers from 2008, 2009. We're not allowed to publish the latest numbers, so today, obviously, they are probably pretty significantly higher. Now good, so you didn't come here to learn about eBay, you came here to learn about test automation. And I've been working in the test field at eBay for the last 7 years. And I've been looking at test automation over the last probably 4 or 5 years. And I noticed an interesting trend, maybe if you want to call that. A few years ago, everybody was really hyped about test automation. That was the thing to do. People just went out blindly and automated everything that they could get their hands on. Now today, and I would say in the last year, I talk a lot at conferences about this topic and also, talk to other companies about this. And we're not selling anything, right? I think that's the cool thing. I'm totally unbiased. I'm not selling any product here. But when I talk to people, I kind of get this, right? This, I'm kind of skeptical of what you're telling and what you're claiming, because we really got burnt the last 3 times by our automation efforts. And we spent a lot of money on our automation tools. We spent a lot of money on consulting hours that didn't change anything in the end, right? And I'm assuming that most of the people in here have probably been in a situation like that. Now, we didn't spend any money on tools, because that's why this thing is about open source tools, right? But I think what's very important is before you even start to automate or do anything, be clear why you want to automate in the first place. And I think that's already the first piece of the puzzle where a lot of people can't give you a real answer to that. Well, because everybody else is doing it, right? Well, that's probably not the best reason to automate. So why did we automate? So we focused on regression testing, right? We figured that's the biggest bang for the buck. That's where we spent a lot of time in manually regressing things week over week. We used to have 2-week release cycles at eBay, so every 2 weeks, you would sit there, click, 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 and not super exciting. So we wanted to save time and actually reinvest that time that we saved back into manual testing, which is a little bit controversial, of course, because we're talking about automation here. What I mean with this is we wanted to let the machine do the boring work and focus the expensive manual engineering horsepower on things like exploratory testing, on things like looking at the new features that came out, because usually that's where the bugs are, and not necessarily so much in regression testing. Safety net, absolutely, right? You need a safety net in end-to-end automation so that you get this gut feel, or this warm fuzzy feeling in your stomach that yes, I feel good about releasing, right? If you don't have a proper automation suite, you never know where you're at, right? In the context of agile projects, we wanted early and instant feedback, right? Having feedback once every 2 weeks about your regression is certainly not doing it in an agile context. You want feedback every single time. Ideally, a developer checks in some code. And last but not least, automation is not about eliminating jobs. Oftentimes when I talk to people, they say, oh, you just want to automate my job away. No, I absolutely don't, right? Our team has actually grown ever since we started automating. But what automation is about, again, is about making the best use of your engineer's time. Yeah. So that's why we automated. There's probably 100 other reasons, but these are the main ones that came to my mind. Now let's look at this picture here. This is the situation still today in many of our projects. I believe probably looks very familiar to you as well, where we have some or maybe no unit tests on the bottom. Then we have some kind of half-baked end-to-end automation tests. And then we do basically everything else manually, right? That's the situation that we started out. And I would say, even at eBay, we're still, some areas still operate like this. Certainly not a good position to be in, right? What we essentially want is a broad base of unit tests. Then you put a layer of integration tests on it, and then the tip of the iceberg, ideally, is the end-to-end automation test, because that's essentially the most expensive kind of testing that you do. As we've heard this morning, right? You need to, reboot a virtual machine, you have to do all kinds of things. That all takes processing power and time. So we want as few of those as possible and as many further down the stack. Now what I'm going to talk about today is that top piece, right? It's the end-to-end automation piece. Now you may want to say, well, why did you focus on that and not on your unit tests? We wanted to, however, we figured that end-to-end automation is kind of the lowest hanging fruit where we can get our objectives, in early feedback and safety net. So we focused on that. And if you have ever worked with code that was not designed with unit testing in mind, then you know that generally making code unit testable requires oftentimes a very significant refactoring, which, for various reasons we couldn't do or didn't want to do. So we said, okay, let's do the end-to-end piece. So that's just as a side note, right? But what I'm going to tell you today about how we did automation really doesn't matter whether you have the unit testing base in place or not, right? So this is just a little bit of, side story to that. I think for many people that I talk to, test automation equals buying a tool. And then they believe that they have everything in place to address this thing called test automation properly. And I would strongly disagree with that, because I think there's a lot more to test automation than just a tool. And that's exactly what I'm going to try and show you today. So we have about 4 parts to end automation. And maybe there's 5 or 6, so we identified these 4 that played a vital role for us. And number 1 is called test aspects. I'm going to talk about that first. The second one is called the modeling of the business domain layer. Fancy word. Hopefully I will be able to shed some light on that. The third step, this is where we actually write code, and this is where we pick our tools. So the first 2 are just kind of, the design phase of things, just thinking about how we're going to do it, what we're going to do, not how. And then the last one, that's a bit fluffy. It's called lean automation and lean software development. So we kind of, try to look at lean development and adapt certain practices for automation. Anyway, so these are the 4 things that I'm going to talk about. And let's start with test aspects. So generally, when you write a test case, everybody who has written a test case, what they do is they look at a user story and then they write down the test case and then they say, okay, well, I need to go to this page, I need to type in this name, I need to click on this button, and then I should go to the next page and I should see this and this. That's a test case that basically says how you're going to do things, but it doesn't necessarily tell you what you do. With test aspects, and we got inspired by this from a presentation at the Swiss Testing Day in 2010, I believe. And I didn't really know what to really do with this at first, and then my engineers came and said, hey, this is actually a really cool concept, to separate the test design from the actual implementation. And what these test aspects do, they describe the what is tested and not the how. Yeah? So they don't contain any steps or any detailed instructions or how to test. They're prioritized along with the product risk, so together with product owners in an agile environment, for example. But it's kind of a high-level test case, that lets you have a conversation with also non-technical people about what you're going to test. Yeah. So what this looks like is, this is our, I'm not sure if on the cheap seats you can you can see that. This is basically a user story from a training that we did, and it tells you, a user story, as a buyer I should be able to do this, and then there's an acceptance criteria to it, right? And so basically what we do is we translate the acceptance criteria into a so-called test aspect, and don't get confused, it says TC29. It's just because Rally, the tool that we're using, doesn't know of test aspects, so Rally only knows test cases, right? But this is actually a test aspect. And if you look at that, and so we say, so this test aspect is called search by name, and the description, the what is tested, is basically search for an item by the name starting from the home page. That's all, right? So this is your high-level design, but doesn't tell you, what exactly you need to do. And then when you look at the user story on the bottom, you can see that basically there's two test aspects that can be traced back to the acceptance criteria. Okay, now that's not really exciting, right? Has nothing really to do with test automation either. But I think a crucial part of your automation later down the road is to actually be clear about what you're going to test in the first place. So what these test aspects allow us to do is it gives you a quick overview for everybody on the team of what is tested or what is automated in our case. Non-technical staff can understand what is automated because, yes, I'm an engineer myself too, but every once in a while I do have to deal with non-technical people, and that's perfectly fine. So I need to find a language that, that I can talk to them. And this, we found, is a very, very good language to do this. We can have quick reviews and walkthroughs with the product owner to then prioritize these so-called test aspects, and we have a traceability between the test aspects and the specification. Okay, cool, right? So this was the first step, and I find this is kind of like, okay, fine, now we know how or what we do, and have like a high-level description or high-level design of our tests. The second step on this little ladder is called modeling of the business domain layer. And this is when we start thinking about coding, right? But maybe we haven't really started coding yet. So what we essentially want to achieve with our test automation code is we want to have modules, right, that are reusable so that they are maintainable in the end and we can extend them so that we don't end up in some kind of crazy maintenance nightmare. And we found that one of the ways to write actually modular code for automation is this point here. It's absolutely crucial for the engineers who write this code or who work on test automation in general to have a really, really deep knowledge of the domain that they're automating. Who in this room has, who has a QA organization where you have your manual testers and then you have an automation group that automates the stuff from the manual testers? And how is that working? Okay. Okay, yeah. And so what we specifically did, or what we specifically found is if the people doing potentially also the manual testing also are able to automate, then they have this probably very good domain knowledge so that they are able to write modules properly. In my team, we take care of 12 European eBay sites. Now, you can imagine that if you have a team for Germany, if you have a team for the UK and France, you will probably end up with a lot of code that looks very similar because eBay isn't that different from country to country. But if you don't have one group of automation folks who are actually looking at as a whole in the domain, then you will probably not end up with modularized and reusable code. Another thing in this business domain layer is we absolutely want to enable data-driven testing. So basically separating the test data from the test case, right? And I always use the selling flow on eBay, for example. So what you can sell 100 different types of items on eBay, but essentially how you sell is probably going to still look the same, right? You go to the selling page, you type in your description, and you attach your pictures, and then you hit a submit button, and then ideally the item shows up on the page. Now we managed to bring that test case down to about 20 lines by completely separating out the test data, which is stored maybe in an Excel sheet, maybe in a CSV file, maybe in a database, depending on what you need, right? So therefore it's also very easy to just change the tests, right? Change the items, for example, that you want to test without actually having to touch your test code that does the clicking and that does all the other stuff. And then we have this concept, and this is not ours, by the way, so this is a very well-established concept. So of tests, obviously, and then pages and flows, and then something we call domain objects. Now, when you look at a web application typically consists of 2 pages, at least, okay, at least 2 pages, right? You have one page where you put some stuff in, and then you hit a button, and then you end up on some results page. So you have 2 pages. And how we represent those pages in code, we represent them as a page object, which basically means you program a representation of that page, right? So this is how you encapsulate how you're going to talk to that page. So this is the stuff that does the clicking, for example, where you say, you know, in Selenium, you said selenium.click, la la la, right? And your test cases, they're not here yet, right? But they should use these page objects to actually do the actions, right? So this is an abstraction of your actual page. Now you have 2 pages, but how do you connect them? How do you get from one page to another page? Well, we call this a flow, and a flow object connects the page and represents most of the time the actual use case, right? Where you say, I want to get from here to here, and that's the thing that kind of drives from one page to another, and then potentially to many, many other pages. So that's the connector, but we still don't have a test at this point. So for us, in our case, we use testmg to write the test, and that basically just triggers the flow by handing in something called a domain object. And this is actually one of probably the most important pieces in your automation. And the domain object contains all the data to drive this. So it would, for example, contain the user that you are going to do this with, or it will contain the item that you're going to pass into the test. And what happens, so this thing kind of took me a long time to do this. This thing traverses basically all, into your flow, onto the pages and back through the flow to the next page. So we basically we basically hand this domain object from page to page through the flow. Okay, so at this point, we may have written some code, but maybe we haven't, right? Maybe this is all just in your head, or in our heads. So I think what's important here, and when we go back to how important it is to have this domain knowledge of the people who work on automation, when we look at page 1, for example. So as I said, we have 12 European eBay sites, and when you take the registration page, when you want to sign up for a user account, that page looks slightly different from country to country. Some have 3 checkboxes for the user agreement, some have 2 fields for the phone number, slight differences. So all those differences would be represented still in one page object of page number 1, rather than having all these different page objects for France, for Italy, for Australia, for the US, etc. Yeah, so I think this is where that becomes very obvious how important it is to have that overall knowledge of the domain. Good. So this was step number 2. Now, you can say, okay, it's kind of, high-level stuff. Now comes my favorite part. This is the slide that I love to talk about, and the stories that are behind it. Test implementation. How do we do this? And the title of this presentation obviously has open source in it, right? So we are using open source, and those are the tools that we're using. VMware is not entirely free and not entirely open source, but we use it basically for the virtualization that Simon was talking about this morning already. And we chose to use Java because we're a Java shop. So the business logic is written in Java, so we also went with that. And then we use TestNG, Hudson or Jenkins, Selenium 2, Selenium Grid. So the gentleman that Simon was talking about this morning, who wrote the Selenium Grid piece, I'm going to show that in a minute, actually works in my team. So he's a very smart man, very, very bright future ahead of him. So anyway, that's coming out of our team. And as I said, Maven, SVN, Git, and Sonar. So that's the tool set that we're using. Now, why are we using open source? We're using open source, very simple, because it works. It fulfills basically every requirement that we have towards test automation. That's the main reason. And there's a few others, like it's free. Okay, that's great, right? However, I would say I would be very happy to pay money for a tool that, that does something better than what we have today. No problem, right? If it does something better, absolutely. Why else are we using open source? Because we're independent from tool vendors who tell you when you ask them for a change that you're going to have to wait about 6 months and you're going to have to shell out $150,000 to make that change. We're independent because we can actually make that change ourselves if we want to, and even better, contribute it back to the project so that other people are able to use that as well, right? That's why we absolutely love open source. And maybe a little side story to this. We weren't sure if open source will really do it for us, right? Because obviously eBay is an attractive company for test automation tool vendors. So they do every once in a while approach me, and they say, Michael, you need to look at our tool. It's gonna change your world. And I say, okay, cool. Let's have a chat. And I'm generally totally open to all of these conversations. And basically, what I always want to look at is the commercial, does our solution with having these open source tools, is that up on par with what's out there for a lot of money sometimes? And last year I had this CEO from a fairly renowned test automation tool company over in Europe come to me, and we went through this, right? And we were crunching the numbers, and he tried to tell me why it's a good thing that I'm going to pay $3 million for a test automation solution, plus a fairly hefty licensing fee that we have to pay every year. Why that would be still worth it? And I said, okay, cool. Why don't you come and show me? And that was actually probably one of my brightest days in the last few years, because the gentleman actually, after about an hour, he said to me, Michael, there is nothing we can do for you, because what you have today is actually, totally better what we can offer you for a lot of money. So I found that I have a lot of respect for that, because that's a very honest thing to say, obviously. And it also gave me the assurance that what we're doing actually can't be too bad, right? If you have somebody basically walk away from a $3 million deal. Now, to the defense of any tool provider out there, we were looking at test execution. How can we run our tests? And of course, test automation providers, they generally also have a lot of other things, right? They have test case management, they have test data creation, and whatnot. So that was not in my scope. But for the test execution piece, that's basically where we landed, that there was absolutely no reason not to use open source. Good. This slide I just put in for those people who are going to download the presentation and look at it. This is kind of our high-level setup. Yeah, I'm not going to go into that right now. Grid. Hey, we've already heard this today from Simon. And we didn't sync up. And you will see pretty much the same pictures that Simon showed. What a coincidence. So today, we have about 3,500 end-to-end test cases that we're running for regression purposes at eBay. And they take about 2 to 3 minutes each, because you have to fire up a browser, you do something, and then you close the browser, and that's it. Let's say that takes between 2 to 3 minutes. If you run that sequentially, that ends up in 5 days execution time. So you can actually take a week of vacation before you, after you kick off your tests, and then you come back, and then you can keep your fingers crossed if everything went through properly. In an agile context, absolute no-go, right? You cannot wait 5 days. Even if you just take pieces of the tests, even if you just run 300 of them, it still takes way too long. Now, this is where the fantastic grid comes in, right? And this is kind of a same picture that Simon showed. Look at how much tests you can pump through if you're running these tests in parallel. And what we did is we have a virtualized environment. We picked 150 virtual machines to do this, just because 150 sounded good. And we brought our execution time for the entire suite of 3,500 tests down to 60 minutes. Now that's still not instant feedback, maybe, but pretty damn close to it, I would say. Yeah? And this is scalable, right? You can add another 100 virtual machines to this, right? And in the end, what Simon said as well this morning is that theoretically, the execution time of your suite is the time it takes for your longest test to run or to fail, right? So it just depends how much you want to scale this up. What this absolutely requires is that you design your tests properly. And which means when you run things sequentially, you don't really have to think about tests kind of interfering with each other. If you run them in parallel, you absolutely have to do that. So your tests have to be pretty much atomic, right? So you have to be able to run them in any order at any time, in any sequence. Yeah, that's important. And for a lot of people probably who have started out with a sequential approach, the first time they ran their tests in parallel, they probably started to cry, right? Because nothing worked. So did we. Good. So this was the third pillar. So test implementation. Right? And of course, this is where this is what everybody is looking forward to. This is what why people joined the team, to actually write code, to write the tests, to do the cool techie stuff. Now there was a fourth pillar up there, and we call it lean automation. And what you see here, these are the lean software development principles. Eliminate waste, build quality in, create knowledge, defer commitment, deliver fast, respect people, and optimize the whole, right? Now, how does that translate into our world, right? Because you can go out and you can write code, right? But you should try to write the right code, right? And not more code than you actually need, right? And I think by applying lean principles, it really helps you to do that. Yeah? So let's look at how that translates into our world. We do constant reviews of our test aspects, of our code, of all kinds of things. Everything we do, we constantly review. And why we do that is because we eliminate waste with that. We constantly, double check, are we still on track? Are we still doing the right thing here? Let's trim the fat, right? The stuff that we don't need to test anymore, maybe because the priority has changed. We just don't do it anymore. We're documenting, yeah, in brackets, the essentials. So engineers generally are not very good documenters, and or they don't like to document, right? Documentation is always something, I'll do it later, and then generally it doesn't happen at all. So that's why we said, well, let's not do it later, let's document, but let's document the stuff that really matters. Don't write a big 500-page book about what you've done. Document the stuff that, for example, somebody else would need when you're going on vacation, or if you get hit by a bus or something like that, right? In a bad case. So documentation, that refers back to creating knowledge. Long leash. Don't worry if you're considering working at eBay, we do not wear leashes, at least not during our working hours. So a long leash translates back into respecting people. Engineers are very creative people, so prescribing them with tools and how they have to do things and what they need to do is completely counterproductive. I just look at this gentleman, Francois, on my team. We wouldn't have Grid, Selenium Grid today if I had told him what to do. I just let him do stuff. He said, you know, Michael, I'm working on this and this is really cool. So I said, all right, I trust you. And today we have this wonderful thing called Selenium Grid that is really changing the way we're testing today. So give your engineers some space. Let them try things out and don't prescribe. Just because you have a fancy title, potentially, you probably don't know anything more than the people who are working with this stuff every day. Defensive programming. We try to write our test in a way, or our code in a way, that we assume the worst. We assume the people who are going to use our code are horrible people and they are trying to break things, right? So write your code like that. Don't build a framework. When I go to the US to talk to people over there at eBay, you know, then they always talk about this framework that we created. And we didn't. All we did is we took some open source tools and we glued them together. We put them together in a, I would say, nice way, but it's not a framework, right? And don't try to build one. Build what you need, but don't build stuff that, you know, some people would like to have, right? But probably don't really need anyway, right? So again, keep it lean. Software craftsmanship. There's a nice book from Pete McBreen out there about software craftsmanship. And it's a big book, but it basically says, write your code like a craftsman. Write your code, or everything that you do, like a carpenter, for example. A carpenter builds a piece of furniture, and that piece of furniture is going to be out there for a long time, right? So write your code in the same way. Everybody who works in the banking industry, I mean, eBay is a young company, but who works in the banking industry here? So you probably see code that is older than you, probably, right? So just think about that. When you write code, the code that you write today very likely is going to be around for a long time. So write it with that in mind. We've seen this in the presentation before about, you know, in Agile projects. Make everything that I told you today, I would suggest make it part of your definition of done. Yeah? Because otherwise, it probably will not be looked at, right? But if it's part of your definition of done to do these things, then I think that's a very strong message that the project team is taking this serious. So this has very, very well worked for us. All right. So this was number 4. I hope that what I talked about today made it very clear that test automation is not just a tool, right? I think the tool is one very tiny thing, but there's a lot more to it that you have to think about, or that I would strongly recommend to think about before you even do anything else in automation. If you haven't already started, if you have already started with automation, then maybe sit down for a day or two and think about it. You know, what am I doing here? Why am I doing this in the first place? What problem am I trying to solve? So be clear why you want to automate. Open source is your best friend. Try it. It's free. It doesn't cost anything, right? And honestly, from a team morale, it's wonderful to see that people are actually able not to just use open source, but actually they are able to contribute back to the society, or not just, well, society, community. And and I think also in many cases you just, when you are a contributor on open source projects, you have the ability to shape that project, to shape that product, right? You are part of that. And people are listening to you. And they're going to vote. They're going to tell you if they don't like something, you know, your feature doesn't get in. But if they like it, then it's going to be in there for good. Flip the pyramid, right? That's what we saw in the very beginning, where, yeah, we were looking at the top end of things. But if you can, definitely work together with development to address that unit testing piece. Because if unit testing is done properly, you will need less stuff on the top, less of the very expensive stuff. Treat automation just as a software project, right? Just anything that applies to regular, you know, the cool stuff, the business logic, the guys who write the business logic, exactly the same stuff applies to your test automation project. No reason to go in, you know, to lower your bar or your standards in any way. Work with the right people. I think that's super important. I'm very lucky to have a team where we have a fairly distributed skill set. So we have manual folks, and we have then, you know, on the other end of the spectrum, we have also very hardcore developers. But we also have these people in the middle. So when you are building the teams, you know, look out for that, to find that balance, you know. Manual testing is super, super important, right? And, but in the right place, right? So when you look at test automation, I would hire, if the people who I would hire to look after automation are developers who have a very strong appetite for testing, right? So we've seen the software, how did you call that at Atlassian? Software sorry? Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I believe Google calls it software engineering test, right? So those are the types of people that I would be looking for. But with this very strong appetite for testing. Stay lean. I think, you know, it's a kind of a fluffy thing, and it looks different every time every time you talk to people, people have a different understanding of it. But maybe the bottom line is just do what you need to do and don't, you know, overcomplicate things. Just keep it lean, trim the fat. And that's it. Thank you very much. It was an absolute honor to be here. Here are my contact details. If you have any questions right now, please do ask them. I believe we have a few more minutes. I'll be here also over the next 2 days, so please do feel free to come up. Or just shoot me an email. I will definitely respond. So if something comes to mind later, absolutely. Would also love to hear just feedback, you know, how things work at your organizations, right? And because, as I said, this is one way how we did it. Probably doesn't work in every organization, but for us it worked very well, and I was very happy to be able to share that. Thank you very much.